Hey, this is Mike McAdam from GenXGuitar. Today I'm going to be doing a review of the Mesa Boogie Rocket 44. This is probably the best amp you have never heard of. So in 2012, I was in Guitar Center one day, like many other days, and I heard someone playing through this amplifier and immediately was wondering what it was because it sounded really good. So this was a used Mesa Boogie Rocket 44, and after the gentleman was done playing the amplifier, I immediately plugged into it and wound up taking it home. The thing that's really unique about this amplifier is, unlike many other Mesa Boogie products, typically with Boogie you have kind of a split in the middle. You have a lot of their Mark Series amps that are very Fender based, or the rectifier amps, which are very heavy metal based. And I can't tell you how many players I have talked about this amp with that immediately figured it was some sort of rectifier clone, but it's not. It's actually very British sounding. So this amp definitely has a Marshall type of vibe to it, but it has EL84 tubes, which changes the power structure of it a little bit and the gain breakup. But I think this amp is phenomenal, and they can be had for pretty short money out there on the used market. There's also a combo version of this amplifier that I don't like as much, but it's very similar, and they seem to be a lot easier to find. So today I'm going to talk about some of the features of this amplifier, some of the things I like, and some of the things I don't like. So this is basically a 2-channel type amplifier. What it has is a clean channel and a distorted channel, and they have a shared EQ and master volume that they share, along with a reverb function. There are a couple of other tone shaping options you have to determine the final output of the amp, which we'll talk about as well. So this first example, I'm going to play the amp in how I would typically use it. And what I would do here is maybe just tweak the EQ a little bit or tweak the gain, but this is basically how I like to play it. And I will give you an example of that, and then I'll talk about how I have it set. So there I have, the mid-range up slightly, the treble up slightly. I have the gain on about 4. This amp has a lot more gain than I would typically use. I find myself not really needing to run the gain higher than 5 or 6, but here it's on 4. And, it depends on what guitar I'm going to use at that moment. So some things I really like about this amplifier: it records really well. I find the times that I have recorded this, it is very easy to get a good sound out of it. The EQ section on it is fairly wide, although I would like them to be a little bit more interactive. I think this is the kind of amp where it takes effects well in the effects loop, but if you really want to open it up a little bit, you can add an EQ in the effects loop, which I think would really help, especially the clean sound. So this amp has, it's called a contour switch, and right now I have it engaged. I don't even know why this is on here because the sound without the contour is pretty unusable. So let me give you an example of what that sounds like. So in that setting, I think the sound is interesting. It's a little more mid-forward. I could see if you turned up some of the high mid-range, it would start to take on more of a Boston type of guitar sound because it has a lot of that compression and sustain to it, but it's just a little too specific sounding for what I would usually use. Like if I was playing a gig or if I was playing in a situation where I needed the guitar to be more open sounding and I could manipulate the controls on the guitar to kind of shape it a bit more. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to sweep through the EQ on the amplifier. I'll just pedal an open A string so you can hear it as it sweeps across the frequencies that affect that note. So I did a couple of examples with how I would typically run the amp. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a lower gain example, and then I will follow it up with a higher gain example. Here's the lower gain example here. So that was with the gain on 2, and even at that volume, you're still able to get, or even at that gain level, you're still able to get some really nice saturation and some nice overtones. You can expand on that by keeping the gain low and turning the master up, and the amp will open up a bit more. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to run with the gain a bit higher, so we'll put it on about 6 or 7 and see what happens there, and I'll play a similar sounding example. Tempted as I was trying not to play the Beavis and Butthead theme. It was this close, but I prevented myself from doing it. Anyway, you can hear things really get pretty saturated at that point, probably more so than I would typically use. But the amp does have a lot of gain on tap, and I don't find it gets overly mushy when you start adding it in there. You still have some pretty decent note clarity and separation. So now we're going to talk about the clean channel on this amp. And I'm going to be honest, I think this is a real shortcoming on this amp. There are some things you can do to help it along a little bit, but I just find it doesn't really have the kind of sparkle or clarity that I would like it to have. Sometimes with these amps, you know, we want a 2-channel amp that does everything. This is not that kind of amplifier. I think it does 1 or 2 things really well, but this is an area where I think they could have improved it a bit. So let's check that out here. Now for that example, I didn't make any adjustments on the EQ. Even with the bass on 3, it was a little woofy sounding, and yeah, I was on the middle position pickup on this guitar, but I find that to get the clean sound to sound good, you have to radically change what the distorted side sounds like, where it's just easier if you want a pure clean amp to use another amp. So I find with this amp, it's very difficult to get the 2 channels balanced, and even when you tweak everything for the clean channel, I think the clean sound is just okay. So that's the shortcoming of this amp. I don't think it takes pedals incredibly well on the clean side, like if you wanted to refine it a little bit. The thing I found that has worked pretty well is just taking an EQ, maybe put it in the effects loop and shape it a little bit for that clean channel. And if you have a way to switch it where you can get both channels to work, that's probably the best option. I'm very intentionally not using any effects with this amp today as far as what's plugged into it, but I have found, like I said earlier, the effects loops works really well with delays, things like that. They don't get in the way of the amp's tone. The reverb on this amp actually doesn't work, which doesn't bother me because I don't think the reverb is that great anyway. In general, I'm not a big fan of reverbs and amps. I find you don't get the control out of them that you would get out of a pedal or a rack unit or whatever you wanted to use. I just find they're a little limiting. So I almost never use reverb in an amp. And I do believe in the idea that if they're out of the circuit, it actually improves the tone of the amp. So I understand I'm in the minority here, but like I said, the reverb on this amp is pretty useless to me anyway. So that's my review of the Boogie Rocket 44. If you followed me on my Mike McAdam YouTube channel in the past, I've had several people ask me about this amp. So finally, here's a review of it, and hopefully you found it useful. And if you find some of these on the used market, definitely check them out. I paid $650 for this amp in 2012, and it's an amp that I'm going to hold on to. I just think it has a special place in my sonic arsenal where I really enjoy using it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep making content like this. In the meantime, I will see you in the next video, and thanks for watching GenXGuitar.